She got her big promotion, and our sex life has gone downhill dramatically. But because of the pressures of her new role and travel schedule, I figured it was understandable. I didn't like it, but I felt I had to put up with it for the sake of our family. She kept telling me that things would get better when she moved to the national level, but that didn't seem destined to happen. It's killing me that I don't have any answers. I don't know what kind of bastard she was sleeping with, I don't know when their affair started or how long it lasted, I don't know if she was in love with this guy or if she was planning on leaving me. Worst of all, I don't know why she did this to me and the kids. As they were wrapping up their dinner, the doorbell chimed. Lori, who was 12 years old, leapt to answer it before her father or brother could react, only to return to the dining table looking puzzled. "Daddy, it's a policeman. He wants to talk to you," she announced. Frank felt a pang of apprehension, but he composed himself, shielding his children from his anxiety. Approaching the door, he found a Georgia State Trooper standing outside. "Are you Frank Parker?" the officer inquired. "Yes," Frank replied. "Are you Meredith Parker's husband?" Upon Frank's affirmation, the officer glanced at the children and requested, "Could I speak with you alone, Mr. Parker?" Frank's throat tightened, requiring a moment to collect himself before responding. "Bobby, Lori, please go to your rooms. I need to have a word with the officer in private." Though initially reluctant, both children complied when their father sternly urged, "Now." It was a tone they rarely heard from him. Once the children had left the room, the officer turned back to Frank. "Mr. Parker, I regret to inform you of some distressing news. Your wife's aircraft has gone missing and is presumed to have been shot down. It vanished from radar earlier tonight, approximately halfway between Miami International Airport and Nassau. The Coast Guard is currently conducting a search in that area for any survivors." The facts were simple enough. Serving as vice president of regional sales for a large multinational corporation, Meredith, along with the region's CFO, was visiting their Caribbean headquarters in the Bahamas. She was an experienced small airplane pilot, so a 180-mile flight to Nassau should have been routine. Frank hadn't given it much thought when Meredith had called and informed him of her plans. Now he was distraught. It was his worst nightmare. His wife's plane had crashed overnight in the shark-infested waters of the Caribbean. The officer gave a few additional details that were not at all reassuring to Frank and promised that the Coast Guard would call in the morning or sooner if there was any news. No sooner had the door closed behind the policeman than Bobby and Lori came running up to him with concern on their faces, asking questions their father couldn't answer. Frank knew they were eavesdropping. He'd be eavesdropping too if he were in their shoes. The three of them huddled together, each trying to find encouraging words to say to the other. Lori began to cry, and though he tried to be brave, Bobby's eyes turned red as well. Frank was trying his best to hold himself together for the sake of his children, but inside, he was beyond furious. Doing the dishes or homework was out of the question. They spent the rest of the evening at arm's length from each other. It was past the time when the children usually went to bed, but there was still no phone call. Finally, exhausted by the late hour and their fears, all three of them moved into the bedroom, and the children fell asleep with their father for the first time since they were small and afraid of thunderstorms. The next morning, they were already up and trying to eat breakfast when a Coast Guard representative called. The faint hope generated by the call was quickly extinguished when the officer informed Frank that the boat combing the area had found nothing. Frank called the principal of the middle school the children attended and told her why Bobby and Lori would be absent that day. He then went to check on them but found them sitting in front of the television watching a CNN report on the missing airplane. Frank wasn't sure if he should let them watch further or turn off the TV, but no sooner had he made up his mind than the phone rang again, and from then on, as soon as Frank hung up after one call, another one came in. Not surprisingly, Meredith's parents and his own were the first to call. All of them were beyond worried, but they were also trying to exude false optimism that she would miraculously be found. Frank promised to call back immediately with any news. Then followed calls from Meredith's friends and co-workers. Everyone wanted to say or do something to help, but none of them had any idea how to do it. The conversations were short and awkward. The most difficult of all were calls from members of the media. He should have expected them, but Frank was caught off guard when the first reporter called. He talked to the Journal-Constitution reporter much longer than he wanted to. Then other media started calling, and when Frank realized what was going on, he started screening out all the calls and answering only those from people he cared about. During all this activity, a procession of neighbors and friends began, each coming to their doors with condolences and food. At first, their generosity was appreciated, as Frank did not have the energy to cook. But soon, he and his children had more food than they could hope to eat in a week. It was an old Southern tradition to express concern and condolences with food, but while Frank appreciated the gesture, every roast and casserole was a bitter reminder that his wife, with whom he had lived for 20 years, was almost certainly dead. The next few days were horrible. The Parkers were virtually prisoners in their own home, held together by a desire not to deal with other people and the hope of some news from the Coast Guard. Frank called the Miami office daily for the latest news, but the reports were always negative. And 5 days after a state trooper showed up on their doorstep, the news they had been dreading came. A Coast Guard officer called to inform Frank that the wreckage of his wife's plane had been found. There was no sign of survivors. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer concluded. "But at this time, we have to cease search and rescue efforts." Frank wanted only one thing, to hide and mourn alone. But there was no such opportunity. Instead, he was faced with an endless list of responsibilities, all of them excruciating. The worst part, of course, was breaking the sad news to Bobby and Lori and trying to comfort them. When they finally calmed down, he had to call family and close friends to let them know. Then he called their church to organize a memorial service. Then the newspaper to write an obituary. More calls followed to inform people of the time and date of the service. By the time he finished the job, Frank felt physically and emotionally exhausted. Somehow, the family made it through the service and began the slow, painful process of trying to get back to normal life. The children returned to school the following week, and resuming a familiar lifestyle seemed to help a little. Frank was less fortunate. He now had a whole new set of responsibilities. At the urging of a friend, Frank contacted a lawyer to find out what his legal responsibilities were. He was shocked to learn that he would have to apply for a death certificate. "But her plane crashed at sea," he protested. "How can there be any doubt?" "I know," the lawyer lamented. "But in the absence of a body and a doctor's note, the court must make an official statement." "Do I really have to wait 7 years?" asked Frank in frustration. "No," his lawyer assured him. "In cases like this one, where a person has gone missing at sea, there are usually no significant delays." After the attack on the World Trade Center, death certificates were issued within days, although some bodies were never identified. You may have to answer some questions, but these cases are usually resolved very quickly. I can draft a petition for you. I can also help you amend all the other documents. When Frank looked confused, the lawyer said, "Well, you know, like joint bank accounts, mortgages, insurance, car titles, wills, anything. While I'm at it, you need to contact your wife's company and find out what benefits you're entitled to and get all your personal belongings." Frank shook his head tiredly in his grief. He couldn't stop thinking about how difficult it would be to unravel the life he and his wife had shared. Now he had one more thing to do that he dreaded, to call the widow of John Collier, the CFO who was on the plane with Meredith. Frank had only met Collier a couple of times at his wife's company events, but he immediately disliked the executive. In Frank's opinion, Collier was one of those narcissistic types who thought they were smarter than everyone else. In the short time Frank spent with him, Collier had managed to list enough names and brag about his accomplishments to leave a bad taste in Frank's mouth. But it was not his widow's fault, Frank reminded himself, and he felt it was his duty to address her. Frank called ahead, and Amanda Collier was already waiting for him. As they exchanged condolences, Frank realized that she was probably the only one who truly understood how he felt. As they settled down in her parlor, she asked affectionately, "How are you now, Frank?" "It's hard, Amanda, really hard. I just can't accept that she's really gone. So many things remind me of her." He shook his head helplessly. "You know what the hardest part is? When I'm on the street or in a crowd of people, I keep thinking I've spotted her. The other day, I must have scared some poor woman half to death when I caught up with her because I thought it was Meredith." He looked at the floor, recalling the memories and his emotions when he realized what he was doing. Amanda looked at him sympathetically. She knew that no words would help. Finally, he looked up at her and asked, "And you, Amanda? How are you doing?" "It's not easy, Frank, but I can handle it," she told him. "The truth is, I'm probably coping a lot better than you are. Jan and I didn't have children, so I don't have to comfort them the way you do. Besides, and she wouldn't tell this to anyone else, Jan and I didn't really get along before all this happened. I've caught him having a couple of affairs in the past, and I think he was in the middle of another affair. If that hadn't happened, we'd probably be headed for divorce a long time ago." "I'm sorry to hear that, Amanda," Frank told her sympathetically. "I can only imagine the conflicting emotions you are feeling." "Yes," she agreed. "One moment, I'm relieved that I don't have to deal with his cheating anymore, and the next, I feel guilty because I don't feel any sadder. And no matter what, some part of me still misses him." "Are you going to be okay financially?" asked Frank, trying to change the subject. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "The good news is that the company insured Frank's life, and since he died while on a business trip under the double indemnity clause, I'll get twice the face value. The bad news is that I'm going to need every penny of that money because I learned that Frank made a series of bad investments in the futures market and severely depleted our assets." What Amanda had said about her late husband didn't surprise Frank. He could not believe that a selfish man like John Collier would be a faithful husband. Besides, the idea that Collier fancied himself a market trader was entirely consistent with Frank's idea of the man. Frank's attention was drawn to Amanda's mention of company-paid life insurance. He remembered his lawyer's advice and made a mental note to contact Meredith's benefits department immediately. If Collier was insured, Meredith must have life insurance, and until he found a job, the funds might come in handy. After chatting for a few more minutes, Frank rose from the couch. "Amanda, please forgive me, but I have to cut my visit short. Billy and Laurie will be getting out of school soon, and I need to pick them both up. But please stay in touch, and if there's anything I can do to help, even if you just need a sympathetic ear, please don't hesitate to call me." When Frank pulled up to their house after picking up Bobby and Laurie, he was surprised to see a car parked out front. Frank led the children into the house through the garage, and a minute later, the doorbell rang. Outside stood a man in his 50s and a young woman dressed in business clothes. "I'm Special Agent Harold Barnes," the man introduced himself, "and this is Special Agent Celia Murray. We're with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. We'd like to stop by and ask you a few questions in connection with your wife's disappearance." Realizing that the two men were law enforcement officers, Laurie wrapped her arms around her father's waist and buried her face in his side. Frank felt her tears wet his shirt and held her tightly against him. "What does that mean?" he demanded angrily before the first agent could speak. Agent Murray intervened. "I'm very sorry we've upset your daughter, Mr. Parker. All we are trying to do is complete a routine check in connection with your application for Mrs. Parker's death certificate. If you would like us to come back later, we will try to do so at your convenience." Frank ignored her and turned to face his daughter. "It's okay, sweetheart, nothing bad happened." The female agent dropped dramatically to one knee, reached into her purse, pulled out a napkin, and held it out to the girl. "Here, honey," she said in a gentle voice. Lori hesitated and timidly accepted the napkin, wiped her eyes, and then blew her nose. When Frank saw that his daughter had calmed down, he put his arm around her and spoke to her. "These people need to talk to me a little bit about your mom, Lori. Why don't you go and start doing your homework? I'll be here in the living room if you need me." With those words, he gave the 12-year-old girl a gentle nudge toward her room. He then turned to face the officers. "If it doesn't take too long, let's try to get it over with." The three of them walked into the living room and settled around the coffee table. "We need to get a little information about your wife, Mr. Parker," the male agent began. "How long were you married?" "We got married in 1990, right after graduating from the University of Georgia," Frank replied, remembering the beautiful brunette he had won over so many years earlier. "And she worked for the International Marketing Corporation until well before she disappeared." "That's right," Frank confirmed. "She was vice president of sales for the southeastern United States." "If her region is the southeast, why would she go to the Bahamas?" a younger woman asked. At IMC, Frank explained, the Southeast included Puerto Rico and the Caribbean as well as the United States. Their Caribbean headquarters was in Nassau, so Mary often had to fly there. "Mary?" the woman asked. Frank felt his voice grow hoarse. "Mary was my pet name for her." Agent Murray reached out and patted him sympathetically on the shoulder. "It's all right, Mr. Parker. I know this is hard on you." The senior agent decided to change the line of questioning. "Was it normal for your wife to fly her own plane on business trips?" "Yes," Frank replied. "Mary's father was a pilot, and she got her license as soon as she was old enough. She took every opportunity to fly herself because she said it made her independent of commercial airline schedules. She said she could get where she needed to go, complete her business, and return home while her competitors were still stuck in the terminal. She felt it gave her an advantage, especially when she was just starting out." Both agents took notes. Then Agent Murray looked up at him. "What about you, Mr. Parker? What do you do?" Frank managed to smile. "I'm a house husband." Noticing their looks, he continued, "I was an aerospace engineer until 3 years ago when my company downsized, and I was laid off. The only chance of finding a new job would have required me to move out of state. But in the meantime, Mary's job was going great. She had gotten several big promotions and was making an excellent salary, plus big bonuses. It didn't make sense for her to quit, so we agreed that I would run the household and take care of the kids while she worked." "And how has this change affected your relationship with Mrs. Parker?" Agent Barnes asked. "What's that got to do with it?" asked Frank, irritably. "Please bear with us, Mr. Parker," the younger woman intervened. "We need to see if any factors played a role in your wife's disappearance. This is routine procedure." Calming down a bit, Frank looked at them both. "Sure, it was a big change for me, but I'm an engineer. I'm trained to measure and evaluate all factors in a design. It was easy to realize that my change in role was the right thing for our family at that moment. I let Mary devote herself to her career and made sure Bobby and Lori were always close to their parents." Neither agent said anything, and it seemed to Frank that the question hung in the air. "I don't mean to say it was easy," he continued. "She was always calling clients or attending meetings at the corporation, so I didn't see her as often as I would have liked. Sometimes I felt like her work came first." He suddenly realized what he was saying and added hastily, "But that's quite common in corporate life. Besides, things have been going well." He caught himself. That things had been going well so far. "Two more questions, Mr. Parker," Agent Barnes said. "Did you notice any changes in your wife's behavior in the time leading up to her disappearance?" "Not really," Frank replied after a moment's thought. "I know she's been under a lot of pressure the last year or so, and her travel schedule has been busier than ever. But Mary said she was in line for a serious promotion. When she got it, she promised that the new job would cut down on her travel and come with a high-ranking position and a big pay increase." "One last question," Agent Barnes said, jotting down notes in his notebook. "Are you aware of any changes in your finances that your wife may have made in the last few months?" "No," Frank answered confidently. "I keep an eye on all our finances and haven't seen anything out of the ordinary." The young woman glanced at her partner. "I think we've taken up enough of your time, Mr. Parker. We'll be able to wrap this up pretty quickly, and we'll let you know as soon as we're done. In the meantime, if you think of anything we should know, give me a call at this number." Having said that, she handed him her business card, and the two agents headed for the door. Frank went back to his children's bedrooms to make sure they had done their homework. When he peeked into their rooms, both looked busy. "They're strong kids," he thought. "They've been through hell and are holding up well. No matter what." The next day, Frank drove to IMC headquarters to visit the benefits department. The head of the department met him and, after expressing her condolences, handed him a box of Meredith's personal belongings from her office. Frank had to swallow when he saw the framed family portrait she kept on her desk. The director then referred him to a specialist to advise him on Meredith's benefits. The first thing he did was examine Meredith's 401k account. Frank had read her annual reports regularly, so he didn't expect any surprises. However, when he saw the total, it was much higher than he had expected. Apparently, Meredith had increased her contributions to her retirement fund over the past year, even more than she was entitled to from the company. She was really trying to provide for her family, the specialist commented admiringly. The specialist further advised Frank to withdraw the funds as soon as possible and roll them into his own IRA to make it easier for him to manage the funds. Another surprise to Frank was the sheet he received describing the insurance benefit he would receive as Meredith's beneficiary. He learned that Meredith had chosen the maximum amount of insurance to which she was entitled, with the accidental death factor factored in. Frank realized with amazement that he would receive Meredith's income for almost 4 years. "The insurance company will pay that amount in annual installments," the woman explained. "Otherwise, the taxes will eat you alive." Payment of all benefits was, of course, contingent on the company receiving a copy of Meredith's death certificate, but after a visit from 2 GBI agents, Frank was confident that would happen soon. Frank left the office building with great relief. He had thought he would have to start looking for another job immediately. Now, he realized that he had a significant reprieve to get his life together. "Thank you, Mary," he whispered fervently. A few days later, Frank was preparing dinner for his family late one evening when the doorbell rang. When Frank went to answer it, he found Special Agent Murray on the doorstep. After he invited her in, she explained the purpose of her visit. "Ah, Mr. Parker, Frank, I wanted to personally inform you that our investigation is complete, and that your wife's death certificate has been issued. You should receive a copy from the court in the mail in the next few days." Frank breathed a sigh of relief. He had believed there would be no problems, but it was good to know that this important task had been accomplished. At that moment, a panicked cry came from the back of the house, and Frank was startled to hear Laurie's voice. "Daddy, help me. Help me?" He turned and rushed to Laurie's room. Celia Murray followed at his heels, her hand reaching for the service revolver in the shoulder holster under her jacket. When Frank burst into Laurie's room, he saw his daughter staring at a large red blood stain on her jeans. "I'm bleeding, Daddy," she wailed. Frank was horrified. "What happened, Laurie? Did you cut yourself?" As he headed toward his daughter, someone's hand grabbed his elbow and pulled him back with sudden force. "Let me handle this," Celia said firmly and pushed him toward the door. "But he protested, but the young woman didn't back down. "I'll handle this, Frank. Just go out into the living room and wait." Something commanding in her voice made him pause, and when the determined young woman blocked his path, he hesitantly retreated into the hallway. Celia calmly closed the door in his face. After 15 anxious minutes, the door opened, and Celia appeared on the threshold. Before Frank could ask a question, she grabbed his arm. "Laurie's fine. You need to go to the store right now and buy a pack of sanitary napkins. Get the smallest size, but hurry." "But Laurie, Bobby," he began to protest. "I'll take care of Laurie and let Bobby know what's going on. You, on the other hand, need to go to the store and get back here as soon as possible," she said. As Frank drove to the nearest store, it hit him, and he began to berate himself. "She's menstruating, you idiot. You should have realized it right away." On the way back, he kept cursing himself for never having talked to his daughter about growing up and becoming a woman. "Oh, Mary, I need you more than ever," he thought in self-pity. When he got home, Celia met him at the front door and snatched the package from him. Looking at the package, she smiled. "You did good, Daddy." Then she disappeared into Laurie's room. After another 30 minutes, Celia reappeared, hugging Laurie, who somewhat shyly slumped back. Frank dropped to his knees and hugged his daughter as she walked over to him. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I should have talked to you about this a long time ago. I just didn't think about it." "It's all right, Daddy," the girl spoke. "I just didn't realize what was going on, and I got scared. See, Celia explained it all to me. Now I know what to do." As she spoke, she took Celia's hand, and Frank realized that his daughter had made a new friend. He stood up and turned to Celia. "Thank you very much. It's good you were here. I must have panicked for a moment." He looked at his daughter. "I'm afraid I'm not very good with girls." Celia smiled, but no sooner had she spoken than Bobby popped up from around the corner. "Just because my stupid little sister has her first period, does that mean we won't have dinner tonight? I'm starving." Laurie shrieked, but Frank grabbed her before she could pounce on her older brother. "Bobby, if you talk to your sister like that again, I guarantee you'll go to bed hungry," warned Frank to his son. But before his threat sounded too ominous, he continued, "Now, go wash your hands and set the table." Then he turned to Celia again. "The least we can do is offer you a meal for all you've done. It's not exactly fine dining, but there's something to eat." The young woman was clearly embarrassed. "Thank you, but I can't interfere." Her protests were cut short, however, when Laurie tugged on her arm. "Please, Celia, stay and eat with us." Looking at her new friend, Celia smiled and said, "Okay, Laurie, just for you." Looking at Frank, she smiled again. "Thank you. I would love to have dinner with your family." The four of them sat down at the table, and Celia was the subject of many questions from the two children about her experiences in law enforcement. Frank ate and listened, both amused by his children's curiosity and delighted at how easily Celia handled their questions. He suddenly realized that for the first time in a while, The two of them seemed to be coming out of a sorrowful shell. When dessert was finished, Frank sent Bobby and Laurie off to do chores and then offered Celia a cup of coffee. As they sat at the table, Frank had a chance to ask his questions. "You seem to be comfortable with Bobby and Laurie. Do you work with young people often?" She smiled. "I actually come from a big family, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. I was the oldest, so I guess I was a second mom to the others." She paused to take a sip of coffee, then continued, "That's why I knew what to do with Laurie this afternoon. I walked each of my sisters through the trauma of puberty." She looked at Frank and smiled again. "For that matter, my dad was as helpless as you are today." Frank grinned mischievously. "Well, all I can say is that I'm glad you ended up here. Even when I finally realized what was going on, I still wouldn't have known how to calm Laurie down so quickly." She smiled in gratitude, but then her expression became more serious. "How are they coping with the loss of their mother?" she asked. Frank sighed. "I guess that's about as well as could be expected. Laurie was very clingy. I think she's sorely lacking in female influence. As for Bobby, it's hard to say. He's gotten moody and a little withdrawn, but I don't know if that's a result of Mary's death or just the fact that he's a teenager now." Celia looked at him sympathetically. "From what I've seen, I think you're doing a great job with them. It's just going to take time, both for them and for you." With those words, she stood up and said, "I really enjoyed the meal, Frank, but I've been intruding on your family for too long. I have to go now, but if you don't mind, I'd like to say goodbye to Laurie and Bobby." When Frank nodded, she walked out into the hallway, and he heard her say goodbye to Bobby. She then spent a few minutes in Laurie's room, and when she returned, Laurie was walking with her arm around Celia's waist. "She really has a new friend," Frank thought in surprise. A few days later, a package arrived in the mail for Laurie. When his excited daughter opened the package, she found a pink stuffed elephant along with a note from Celia. Frank was delighted by this gesture but was puzzled by the choice. Laurie's too old for stuffed animals, he thought, but was surprised to see the toy take a prominent place on Laurie's bed. "I guess she still has a little girl in her," he admitted. The next day, he called Celia's office to thank her. "I never would have thought of it," he admitted, "but somehow, it was just what was needed for Laurie." Celia was pleased that her gift had brought joy to Laurie and made Frank promise to keep in touch and let her know how Laurie and Bobby were doing. A few weeks later, Frank was paying his bills when Bobby's teacher called him one morning. "I'd like to meet with you to talk about your son," the teacher told Frank. "He's having discipline problems at school." Frank agreed to meet with her the next day but decided not to say anything to Bobby that night. He wanted to wait until he knew what was going on before confronting his son. The meeting was scheduled for the next day after school while the children were in physical education. Mrs. Sana, the homeroom grade teacher, told the concerned father that Bobby's behavior in class had gotten worse over the past few months. "At first, I didn't want to say anything because I know he's been through a lot," the teacher explained, "but it seems to be getting worse. He's getting more and more distracted, not doing his homework, and the other teachers tell me that he's not paying attention in their classes. So far, he's always studied well, but this semester, his grades will drop a lot if he doesn't do anything to change the situation." Frank was concerned. "Do you think, Mrs. Sana, how much does being a teenager have to do with it?" "No doubt, it is a difficult age for children, especially boys," she told him, "but we are used to it. I think his mother's death is affecting him more than he could tell you. Perhaps you should see a psychologist." Frank thanked the woman and returned to the car, anxiously waiting for the kids to finish their gym class. He was upset to hear about Bobby's problems and was determined to have a long talk with the boy. When Frank brought Bobby and Laurie home, he sent Laurie to her room to start her homework and then led Bobby into the master bedroom. The boy's face darkened, he realized he was in trouble. Frank recounted his visit to Bobby's home teacher and gave some examples she had given him. "What's going on, Bobby? Why are you acting like this?" demanded Frank. "Just so," the boy replied sullenly. "Come on, you're smarter than that," his father waved him off. "Don't you care about your grades?" "Not really," Bobby muttered. Frank was annoyed by his son's unresponsiveness and, in anger, tried to shame him into responding. "What would your mother think if she found out you blew it?" "Who cares?" shouted Bobby angrily back. She was such a... In shock and anger, Frank grabbed his son and yelled at him, "Don't you ever talk about your mother like that. How can you say that?" Frightened by his father's fury and the pain of his tight grip, the boy whispered, "I saw her. I saw her doing it with that man." As soon as the words were off his lips, he collapsed on the bed and began to sob. In amazement, Frank sat down on the bed next to his son, put his arms around him, and cradled him as if he were a small child. "It's all right," he repeated, trying to soothe the boy's obvious distress. When Bobby's crying subsided, Frank lifted his son's head. "It's all right, Bobby. I'm not mad at you. Just tell me what you saw." His son looked at him with tears in his eyes. "It was last fall. You let me ride my bike to school one day, but I forgot my math homework. So, I sneaked home at lunchtime and took it. While I was looking for it in my room, I heard my mom come in. I didn't want her to catch me, so I hid. That's when I heard a man's voice." "What man?" asked Frank, a little too quickly. "I don't know," Bobby said. "Some guy. I've never seen him before." "It's okay," Frank reassured him. "Just tell me what happened next." "They came in here, and then it got quiet, and I thought I could sneak out. But then I heard my mom make a funny sound, and I got scared, and I looked into the room, and they were lying on the bed." The words came out of his mouth faster and faster, like he was desperate to spit them out. And when he was done, he burst into tears again. "Why did she do that, Daddy? How could Mom act like such a..." Listening to his son's story, Frank felt himself going numb, but he didn't have time to deal with his own emotions. His son needed him. "I understand, Bobby. It's okay. I'm sorry you had to see that, but I'm glad you told me." He gently took his son by the shoulders and turned him around to face him. "Sometimes, people we love make mistakes or do something we don't like. It doesn't mean we don't love them anymore, just that we don't like what they did. I don't know why your mother did what she did, son, but I know she loved you and Lori very much. I want you to remember only good things about her." He hugged his son and continued to talk to him for a while longer. When he felt the boy had calmed down enough, he gently asked him to get started on his homework, and Frank went to the kitchen to make dinner. Before Bobby left, Frank asked him not to say anything to Lori. The boy promised, and Frank was sure he would keep the disturbing news from his sister. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but as soon as the children went to bed, Frank began to vent his emotions. His first reaction was to deny what Bobby had told him. His son must have been mistaken or misinterpreted what he had seen. But he couldn't stick to that logic for long. His son was too upset about what had happened. After this confession, Frank's thoughts turned bitter. How could Mary have betrayed me? He thought. We had a solid marriage. How could she have been having fun with someone on the side? And anyway, who was that man, and how long had the affair lasted? It's hard to lose your wife in a plane crash, he thought in despair. It's even worse to find out you lost her long before that. Sleep didn't come that night, and the next day. Frank was in a black mood. It was Tuesday, the day he usually went to the gym. After the kids had gone to school, he decided to continue his exercise routine for a while. The exercise helped distract him, but when he sat down on the treadmill, his thoughts returned to his wife's infidelity. How could Mary do that, and in our own bed? He asked. Somehow, the location made the betrayal all the more horrible. And how could she have known I wouldn't be home? But the answer came immediately. It must have been one of those days when I went to the gym. I'm such a habitual person that she was sure the house would be empty. But the answer to that question immediately spawned others. If she planned her little meeting to fit my schedule, it's not like it happened suddenly. How often did she meet with him? She couldn't have met him every week, her travel schedule could have gotten in the way. Each question seemed to beget another, and each one only added to his misery. He tried his best to act normal around Bobby and Lori, but over the next few days, he continued to suffer. He decided to go to the pharmacy to buy antacids. He'd never had stomach problems before. His misery was compounded by the fact that he had no one to talk to about his discovery. He certainly didn't want to tell his parents or Meredith, he knew the news would devastate them. Likewise, he didn't want to talk to his friends, risking becoming the subject of neighborhood gossip. And he thought, I certainly don't want to risk any of my classmates teasing Bobby or Lori. He felt trapped. He was working at his desk one evening when he noticed Celia Murray's business card. She told me to call her if I had any more information, he remembered. But in truth, he was desperately looking for any excuse to share his news with someone and get another point of view. He called the cell phone number she'd written on the card, and when he introduced himself, Celia seemed pleased to hear from him. But her tone changed to concern when he said he needed to talk to her. Are Lori and Bobby all right? She asked anxiously. They do, but I don't, he replied. Would you mind having lunch with me tomorrow? It's not something I want to discuss over the phone. She quickly agreed and suggested a place near the GBI office where she worked. It's a quiet place, we can talk, she assured him. As he hung up the phone, Frank felt a little relieved at the prospect of talking. Celia was waiting in the restaurant when Frank appeared in the doorway. She smiled in greeting, but the smile quickly disappeared when she saw the distressed expression on his face. After they sat down at the table and ordered, she couldn't take it anymore. For heaven's sake, Frank, what's wrong? She asked. You asked me to let you know if I had any more information about my wife, he said. I don't know if it has anything to do with your investigation, but I just found out that Meredith has been cheating on me. As he said this, he was ashamed as tears flooded his eyes and streamed down his cheeks. Celia reached across the table and grabbed his hands. Oh Frank, this is terrible, tell me what happened. The whole story of the meeting with Bobby's teacher, the confrontation with his son, and Bobby's painful revelation poured out, interrupted only by the appearance of food. Celia listened in silence, letting him narrate at his own pace. Only when he reached the end did she speak. Poor Bobby, she said. No wonder he behaves like that at school. It must have been festering him ever since it all happened, and then her death. No wonder he's so worried. She had let go of Frank's hands when the waitress brought their order, but now leaned across the table to reach for him again. It's hard for me to imagine what this has done to you, Frank, she said quietly, and Frank saw the sympathy in her eyes. Were there any signs that something was wrong, Frank, now that you look back? Did you notice any clues? She asked. No, he replied. I can't say I saw anything. You know what they say, the husband is always the last to know. He lowered his gaze to his untouched plate for a moment, then looked up at the woman again. Ever since she got her big promotion, and our sex life has gone downhill dramatically. But because of the pressures of her new role and travel schedule, I figured it was understandable. I didn't like it, but I felt I had to put up with it for the sake of our family. She kept telling me that things would get better when she moved to the national level, but that didn't seem destined to happen. It's killing me that I don't have any answers. I don't know what kind of bastard she was sleeping with, I don't know when their affair started or how long it lasted, I don't know if she was in love with this guy or if she was planning on leaving me. Worst of all, I don't know why she did this to me and the kids. Celia, he squeezed her hands, Frank, please listen to me. The truth is, it's unlikely you'll ever get answers to your questions. You're going to have to forget about all of this. With her dead, none of it matters anymore. All you can do is focus on taking care of your family and yourself. I know you're right, he said, but it hurts so much to be betrayed like that. I think when she stopped loving me. No, said Celia fiercely, you are wrong. No matter what happened, it's obvious that Meredith still cared deeply about you and the kids. Look what you learned at IMC. She bought maximum life insurance to make sure you were all protected. She maxed out her contributions to the 401k plan to put money aside for your future. I don't know what else has happened in her life, but it all looks like care to me. Thank you, Celia. I'll try to remember that. When they got up to leave, he looked at the table. None of them had touched their food. I guess I'm not a good choice for lunch, he remarked. Don't worry about it, she replied lightly. Skipping a meal or two is probably good for me. Frank looked over her slender figure. She looked pretty good to him. It's been a long time, he said to himself, regretfully. As they were walking out the door, she took his hand.